Hello and welcome. In this lecture, we're going to be talking a little bit about the political side to how you move from taking evidence and encouraging a healthcare system to adopt those proposed changes. So specifically, here we're talking about the step 9, which is that decision to change practice. Now, first off, why would you decide not to change practice? Sometimes that's actually the right decision. Sometimes you might find that the evidence that you have identified really isn't relevant for the practice context that you're working in. It might be that the findings that you're looking at just don't seem to be quite consistent. Or, it might not have, the evidence might not be representative of the people that you're working with. So maybe all the research was done at academic institutions and you're in a rural setting, for example. There's also issues around whether or not evidence actually matches up with what we know from our experience. So sometimes that evidence may not actually be consistent with those other non-research sources. And if that's the case, sometimes you might question whether or not this is the right way to go. The big ones here are often feasibility and risk-benefit. So feasibility is just the reality of, can we afford this? Is this something that we can do? Do we have the energy to do it? So, in healthcare context, we're always making changes. And you can make a certain number of changes at a time. So very often you're having to make multiple changes at once. There will often be multiple changes going on in a clinical setting. But, if you have 2 or 3, that might be feasible. But if you have 10 different projects that are going on at a time, maybe that's not reasonable. So it might just not be something that people have energy for, even if it's a good idea. There's also the cost elements, right? So, sometimes you could take on a new clinical practice change, but you might not have enough funds to fund it well. Well, what can happen if you do something that isn't properly funded? Well, sometimes that can actually backfire and it could perhaps even cause harm, right? So you don't want to jump into something before you're ready to fund it or capable of funding it. So these practical considerations are actually important and reasonable to consider in that decision around practice changes. And then there's sort of the risk-benefit ratio. So risks are something that we consider. Do we feel confident enough if we're making this change that it's not going to cause harm to our patients, right? Do we feel like that evidence is solid enough? The higher the potential risk, the more careful we have to be about whether or not we're going to make a substantial change in practice. So thinking a little bit about those things and having those hard conversations is a very reasonable thing to do, even if the evidence says, on the whole, it looks like making this change would be a good thing to do. So when we're thinking about this also from a political side, you also want to consider just generally the timing of these issues. I've mentioned, a timing issue might be, are lots of other projects going on right now and we just don't have the energy. Another one would be historically, how has this looked in the past? So has another person in the past year or two tried to make this change and has that failed? Well, following directly on someone else's attempts that haven't succeeded can actually be kind of discouraging, right? So it might be much harder to actually make this change. Maybe it's better to push that off a little bit longer. Or if somebody's recently succeeded, sometimes you can actually build on that momentum to do something that might have been harder in another context. You also want to look at other factors that are going on in your context, in your institution or the larger healthcare environment. Being savvy about those contextual factors will actually really help you decide whether or not this is a good time to do this. And then thinking about how your change will actually impact other elements. So how will that impact your institution, for example? Is that going to cause challenges or problems elsewhere in the institution? And if so, would waiting be a better choice? So once you think about some of those factors, one of the best things to start considering is who do you need to work with? Who are people who would care about this type of practice change? And these people, a term that's often used for this is the stakeholders, that are essentially people or groups or organizations that have a legitimate interest in what you're trying to do, right? So those are your stakeholders. And these are really important people to know about and also to engage with in different types of ways. So, when we're thinking about healthcare context, there are a lot of different potential stakeholders that are out there. We often just go directly to thinking about the administrators at the site that we're working at, but there's committees, the different clinicians who will be working in this context, patients. You can also think about different organizations or regulatory agencies. There's a whole range of different unions, the public, all sorts of different people that you could potentially engage with as potential stakeholders. And exactly who those stakeholders are going to be is really going to vary depending on what you're trying to do. But the idea here is to really spend some time up front to think about who would care about this practice change. So one way to figure out who might care, who these key stakeholders are, is to ask a few questions. So who is already interested in this clinical problem? Who might actually influence the decision that you're trying to make? Who is in a role of making that decision? Who will win and lose? All right. So some people will typically, when you make a change, it's going to impact people in different ways. And usually it will have both pros and cons. So if you're making a change to how nurses are going to engage in a certain type of procedure, that might require that they have to do more work. And if they have to do more work, you have to have some good reasons for why they need to make that change. So knowing who is going to be impacted, who's going to win and lose, what those benefits are, will help you identify those stakeholders. Who has relevant information or expertise? So knowing if people have tried this before, that would be helpful. If you have specific experts who you can bring in to help advise you, that can be really important. And then who could be angry if they're not included? There's some people who might not actually care that much about your practice change, but if you don't talk to them, they'll be angry and they might try and block you at some point. So just thinking about those types of considerations and those personalities can make a difference. Now, remember, as you sort of are getting hints at in this analysis, stakeholders don't always have to be people who actually want your change. You also want to identify the people who might oppose your change. Those are also stakeholders. And those are folks who you have to think about, recognize, and think about their interests as well in this process. So there's a grid, this idea of stakeholder analysis. There's a way of actually strategically thinking about assessing your stakeholders to maximize your likelihood of successfully navigating this political process. And I find this sort of a helpful 2x2 grid for thinking about this as you're identifying these stakeholders and starting to analyze what the implications they have for what you're trying to do. So there's two axes here. The first is the influence of a stakeholder. So how much of an influence would that stakeholder have on the decision about whether or not to go forward or not? And the second axis at the bottom is the interest of the stakeholder. So how interested are they in this process? And now interest could be positive or negative. So they could be really interested but oppose your point of view. So a key player or one of those key stakeholders might actually still be somebody who is really concerned about your approach. All right. Now, if you think about this using this grid, you have people who have lower interest and lower power. Well, these are typically, or lower influence. These are folks who may not be as important for you to focus on in terms of engaging with stakeholders. They still might be important in some way, but you would typically, for these folks, try and perhaps encourage them to engage or be interested, but it might not be something that a group that you would really focus in on. All right. Then you have stakeholders who may not have much interest in your project or may not know a lot about it, but they might be really important in terms of their power over this decision about whether or not to make a change. Well, those are folks that you really have to move over into the key player category, where they are actually interested in your project and will help support your project. And then you have some folks who might be really interested, but may not have as much power. So those might be patients who might really care about some types of type of process change because they've had a negative experience, for example. But they may not be very involved in making that actual practice change. themselves are making that decision. But those are still people who you might want to engage and make aware of what's going on. Now, typically, very often, by starting to chart out where each stakeholder falls using this grid, you'll be able to identify the people that you really have to focus in the most on. But you also can start thinking about some of those other categories of stakeholders and how you can levy support to actually promote change. All right. So when you're thinking about these, once you sort of identified these stakeholders, you thought a little bit about some of those power dynamics, what I actually recommend is to create a table based upon a few different questions that will help you to actually design a plan for going forward in terms of negotiating the politics in your healthcare setting. All right. So the first bullet point is really here what I talked about in the previous slide. So first, how important is that stakeholder, each of those stakeholders for that decision? What is their power level in terms of making that decision? And what is their current level of support? Are they opposed or supportive? All right. Second question is, based upon what you know of the stakeholder, what do you want from them? All right. What are you hoping best case scenario for them to do? All right. So once you know what you want from them, it's also important to also think about what they actually want, what's important to them. So very often we make the mistake of when we're trying to negotiate these politics of focusing in on what we want and asking people to give us what we want. Well, in some ways that can be really backfire on us, because remember, other people have other interests, they have other desires, and they have other priorities. And to go to people with the assumption that your priorities and your interests will automatically be theirs is potentially a disaster, right? So what can really help in terms of gauging people in those types of communications is really thinking about what they care about. And when you design your communication, you think about, how do I pitch my proposal based upon what they need and want, right? So from the beginning, coming at it from their perspective or thinking about it from their perspective can really forearm you in terms of actually succeeding with your intervention. Now, another thing to consider is worst case scenario. If they had a problem with what you're trying to do, how could they potentially block you? So if you don't actually succeed in engaging them with them as a stakeholder, what potentially could happen? And that's just to be forearmed, right? And be aware of how those politics might align, right? And then finally, what is your strategy for enhancing support among that stakeholder? Now, this is going to vary. And, when you look at these different stakeholders and their priorities and what you want from them, you're going to have to think carefully about what is the right way to engage with them. Now, this is going to vary, so I can't give you a recipe for how to do this. I'm going to talk about some different options later. But it's important here in designing this strategy to think about both the people who you like and who you think will support what you're trying to do, and also the people who are going to oppose what you're trying to do. Remember, a lot of people who are opposing what you're trying to do might be for very reasonable purposes, and sometimes emotional reasons are understandable, right? Or things that may not be based upon evidence, right? So when we go into this thinking our evidence says this is the right thing to do for health practice, there are a lot of other priorities and concerns. So thinking about those people who might oppose you and thinking about, one, how can you potentially convince them to change their mind is one possibility. The second possibility is thinking about how maybe if you're not going to get them to change their mind, maybe you can convince them to sort of step back and not actively oppose you, right? So that might be a way to do that, all right? And then the third is some people may never support you. And if they are never going to support you and they're going to be an active opponent, you can think respectfully about how you can handle that situation. So there are different strategies there. Sometimes you can go around that person. That's a risky approach, but that is one thing that you can do. There are ways to potentially use different types of influence to try and influence your decision about how to handle this. But you have to think about this carefully. So The reason that I talk about doing this using a table is that if you actually ask yourself these questions and do an analysis of each of these stakeholders, you will actually come out of it with a pretty good idea of the politics that you're engaging with here. Now, this table is probably not something you want to circulate publicly, right? Because people don't typically like to see how they've been analyzed in this way. But it is something that's actually going to be very helpful for you to pragmatically think about how to strategically approach policy change. All right. So when you're thinking about taking this information and creating a communication policy, you might think about a few different factors. First off, one is who is doing that communication. So when you're addressing this, to consider who is the right person to do this. Very often, the person who's leading this evidence-based practice process thinks that they're the best person to do it. And that's not always the case. Sometimes the best approach is actually to have the friend of the person who you're trying to influence, right? Or somebody who's highly respected for various different reasons, in the champion sort of model of doing things, right? So thinking carefully about who that person is, and their position within that organization to create a good communication strategy is a very wise thing to do from the beginning. The second question is how. And we're going to talk about some different possibilities in a second. But by thinking about those who and how elements and, of course, the what of what you're going to try and do will actually dramatically increase the likelihood that you're going to succeed with this. So I'm going to talk about 4 different possible strategies for communication that might be useful for you. The first is a direct communication strategy. So this is very often the most efficient way of doing something. So imagine that you have an organization and the person in blue is the person who you want to influence here. Now, the bubbles in green are the people who are supporting this. The person in blue is people you want to influence. The people in yellow are people who might go either way and that you can possibly influence. And then the person in red is suggesting somebody who might be opposing you. All right. So this is just a way of sort of visualizing this, and this was actually provided me by Stephanie Reynolds, who did a nice job of sort of creating these possible strategies and let me talk to you about it using her approach. So anyway, the direct strategy is talking about going directly to that leader, that person who makes a decision. Now, this is kind of risky in some ways because it's kind of bypassing all the other people in this potential process who might care about this, other stakeholders. It does have some advantage in terms of efficiency, right? If you can get the person who makes a decision to just make a decision, well, that's much faster. But as you're doing this, you might think about a few different things. As you go to somebody, you might gather some information about that leader to think about what do they want and what the different considerations are. You also want to be able to talk to that leader about what types of pushback they might expect, right? And what the implications for the organization are of what you're trying to propose, right? So that's one potential approach to take. Another approach is called the BeachHead strategy. And the idea behind this is instead of engaging with all the different stakeholders and instead of going after that leader who you're hoping to change, ultimately in terms of making a decision about the entire institution, instead we're going to work with one potential stakeholder and try and show success in a small context. All right. So you're going to try and do an initial project where you show that this idea will actually work. And that can help build support and leverage and evidence to show that this actually makes a difference and is something that the wider institution should take on. All right. This can be a lot faster to start things rolling. And especially if you're expecting certain types of opposition, this can sometimes be a really effective way of doing things, knowing the personalities of the different people involved in these decision-making processes. So this is a possible useful approach to consider. Another is a lateral approach. And here's where you're not going directly to that leader who's making the decision. Instead, you're talking to the people who might influence that leader. Okay. So you're talking, for example, to some of the people who might oppose this change, thinking about how to change their mind or get them to step back. Or you're also thinking about people who really that leader respects and trusts, and getting them to help convince that person. Again, there's the idea that sometimes having somebody else be that champion to influence that leader can be the best way of doing this, right? So coming at it laterally. And then finally, sometimes for really complex institutional change processes, you really have to be talking to everybody all at once, right? And through those conversations, through many different stakeholders, you can actually come together and start making those decisions. This is the most complicated way of developing a communication and change strategy, but it is sometimes the best thing for these complex institutional change processes where you really, if you aren't talking to everybody all at once, you're going to make mistakes or possibly not create an intervention that's as effective as possible. All right, so this lecture is really trying to talk a little bit about the political side of how we actually make decisions about whether or not to change practice. And again, when we think about these processes, often our mistake is that we think we make decisions based upon the evidence that we see. And very often in healthcare, we don't. It is both about that evidence, but it is also about the politics and the policies and the pragmatic elements of the system that you're working with. And by using some of these strategies, thinking about this carefully beforehand, you can really be forearmed in terms of strategically approaching this in a way that is actually likely to maximize your success. So thank you very much for listening. I hope that is helpful, and take care, everyone.